All right, so we are going to begin a conversation about George Washington and John Adams, early presidents, obviously, of the United States of America. I really want to encourage you all to have your presidency charts handy as we have these conversations. There's such a nice way to organize your thoughts and your notes for each of the presidents that we will be discussing in detail in this class. So make sure that you have your presidency charts out as you listen to these video notes, as you read through your Brinkley text, and also as you annotate your AMSCO. All right, so we're going to jump in with a general overview of these guys. All right, so George Washington, our leader from 1789 to 1797, and he, of course, rose to prominence in the American political scene due to his leadership, his American leadership in the 7 Years' War. He is an incredibly well-respected figure and someone who seemed to be the natural choice as first president. His vice president is going to be John Adams. His cabinet is really an all-star cast. You have Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as his Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as his Attorney General. We tend to think of of George Washington as being this sort of almost godlike American figure of mythology, and not a real person whose presidency did have specific policies and did have controversies. And we're going to just mention a couple of those things. I know that when I was a student, I would often think about George Washington as just this guy above the fray who never took a side and never had a strong opinion and just sort of existed, and everybody else did the politicking. But George Washington was a pretty skilled politician. Yes, as we will learn, he did not like the idea of political parties. He thought that they would be unnecessarily divisive, which that is a very interesting conversation that we can have these days, right? But he did have strongly held beliefs about the role of the national or the federal government. And we're going to be talking in this unit about federalists versus anti-federalists, and you can put George Washington in the Federalist column. He believed that there was a need for a strong national federal government. And yes, that there was certainly a place for state governments, but that the federal government shouldn't be weakened to make those state governments stronger, if that makes sense. We're going to be talking more about federalists versus anti-federalists. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 is a controversial event that happens during his presidency. The farewell address is something that he is probably most known for, other than just the fact that he was the first president of the United States. In terms of his foreign policy, the French Revolution happens under George Washington's, well, not under George Washington's watch, but during George Washington's tenure as president. And there has to be a decision about how the U.S. will respond to that. Is the United States going to stay out of it? And if they don't stay out of it, if they get involved, whose side do they get involved on? There's also the Jay Treaty and the Pinckney Treaty. The Jay Treaty is important because it essentially calms tensions between the British and the Americans and allows for the Americans to continue a strong economic relationship with the British, and also removes the British from some of the Northwest Territory that they had been occupying. The Pinckney Treaty is slightly different. The Pinckney Treaty is going to be with Spain. It's going to define the border between United States territories and Spanish claims, but also allow the United States to have full and complete navigation of the Mississippi River. So those are very important treaties. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is also important, especially if you think about the Judiciary Act in the context of Washington as a Federalist, because this Act of 1789 is going to establish the federal judiciary, the system of judgeships and judge appointments, etc. It also establishes lower federal courts, each federal district court in each state, and also an attorney general. Hamilton is going to be an important figure, as we mentioned in the last little slide there. Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. That's kind of a position these days that doesn't always get a whole lot of press, but not so under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton. And I'm going to guess, if you took this class, you're interested in U.S. history, and so perhaps you have seen Hamilton, the musical, which is wonderful. And I really like Alexander Hamilton. I always really have. And so I think it's very cool that he was sort of, he's been brought into the national spotlight because he was sort of a forgotten founding father for a very long time. And now probably the opposite of true is true. He might be getting a little more press than he is relatively important. Anyway, essentially, he is going to try to tackle this issue of debt. Think about how much it costs to fight the Revolutionary War. And between the national government and the state government, there's over $75 million worth of debt that this new government now has to decide what to do with. And there is a real question of whose responsibility it's going to be to pay down the debt. If the states incurred the debt, should the states pay it down, or should the federal government assume the state debt and allow potentially for those state economies to flourish in a way that maybe they couldn't if the national government did not assume the debt? He has to deal with the fact that the national currency is worthless. States are having their own currencies. It's causing a lot of headaches in terms of interstate commerce. He has to deal with that. And there is little to no foreign credit. Foreign governments are looking at the United States going, we don't think that you are a worthwhile custodian of a credit line, right? So they're not extending credit lines to the United States. The United States is not taking on debt, right? Countries don't want to owe them money, or countries don't want to lend them money, excuse me. And so he is going to also be pushing for the establishment of a national bank, something that he says will manage revenues, will manage and produce currency, and also manage and pay down debt. And he believed that the national government should assume state debt. He thought that the National Bank should be a private institution, something that wasn't under the control of any certain branch of the government. And he believed that the federal government had the ability to establish a national bank using the necessary and proper clause. It essentially says they can do everything, the president can do everything as long as it's anything as long as it's necessary and proper. And so he believed that this was necessary and proper. The sources of revenue that the United States is going to have in this time period are twofold. You can have a tariff, which would be a tax on imports. You can also have an excise tax. An excise tax is just a tax on a specific item. So if you have a tax on gasoline, that's an excise tax. You might have heard of sin taxes before, S-I-N, sin taxes. That's when you tax things like cigarettes or alcohol, or even in some cities, they've started to tax certain sizes of sodas, soda drinks. So those are sin taxes, but they would also be considered excise taxes. So any tax that's only for a specific item is an excise tax. He also advocated for protective tariffs, so tariffs that are, if a tariff is a tax on imports, a protective tariff is a tax on imports that is so high that it effectively shields or protects American industries because it makes the products produced by those American industries much less expensive than foreign good competition. Now, if you are a northern manufacturer, you love protective tariffs because you're exporting or you're producing these items and you're selling them to the citizens of your country, and you want to be the cheapest option without having to sacrifice profit. However, if you are a southern farmer, let's say, for example, you don't like protective tariffs because you're taking your produce and you are selling it in large part overseas. Remember, the South shipped a lot of their goods over to England to sell in other countries in Europe. And so if the United States implements a protective tariff, Europe will do the same thing. They'll do it sort of in a retaliatory kind of way, right? So Northerners tended to favor the idea of a protective tariff, Southerners not so much. Now, there are people who oppose this. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison hate this idea. They're really famous anti-federalists, meaning anti-federalists believed that states should have more power. Maybe not more power than the federal government, but there should be things that the federal government cannot do, and that power should reside within the states. They believed that it was unconstitutional. They did not like the use of the necessary and proper clause. They didn't think it applied, and they didn't think it was necessary or proper. Mostly British financial investments are going to be involved in the establishment of the national bank. And so there were those who didn't like that, who wanted to see maybe a more diversified portfolio. There was concern that state banks and governments would be undermined with the national debt and bank plan. And they felt that it favored bankers, merchants, businessmen in the North and weakened farmers, Western settlers, etc. There is going to be a compromise. It's called the dinner table bargain because it happens at a dinner party. And essentially, Hamilton and Jefferson sort of agree that they will have a national bank, that the national government will assume the debt, but there will be a national capital in what was then considered the South, in Washington, D.C. I don't consider Washington, D.C. To be Southern, but I guess it technically is. So the national capital would be in the South and not somewhere in New York or Philadelphia, right? That it would be further south, and then they would go ahead with the national bank. The Whiskey Rebellion is a controversy during the George Washington administration. It lasts a few years from 1791 to 1794. It is in response to an excise tax on domestic whiskey. Remember that an excise tax is just any tax on a specific item, a specific type of good. And in this case, it was whiskey. Well, the Western Pennsylvania farmers did not appreciate that tax. And as a matter of fact, they were sort of shouting some very revolutionary era themes, like this is an unfair tax and we are not going to pay it. And we are going to attack the tax collectors who are coming to take this tax. This is a big deal because in Pennsylvania there were distilleries, there was a lot of whiskey distribution, and there was this feeling that the federal government was overstepping its bounds. George Washington does something very important here. He sends in federal troops, essentially, right? He asserts federal authority. He squashes the lawlessness, and the troops are literally led by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. This is huge. Washington is saying to states, to these rebels, we are not doing this. This is not going to be something that we are continuing to do. We are not going to cry about taxes. We are going to be part of this new country, and so therefore we are going to have to pay some kind of our fair share. And he believed this was a fair tax. So the public can, of course, say we don't like these laws, but lawlessness is not going to stand, and at some point the federal troops will be required to come in. And I really think that in this current climate, this is such an interesting conversation of at what point does protesting turn into lawlessness, right? And I realize that the Whiskey Rebellion is not the same thing as what's going on today, but it is still this interesting dichotomy of when it's appropriate for the federal government to come in and assert control. So George Washington is setting some precedents here that lawlessness is not going to be allowed, that the federal government can put it down, and that the federal government has the power to tax. Okay, Jefferson is furious over this. And remember, Jefferson is part of Washington's administration, but although Washington is a Federalist, Thomas Jefferson is an anti-Federalist. And so there's this weird situation in the administration where a lot of people with competing ideas exist. There's a little image on here in the top right where it says, "Be a rebel, ride gravel." There is a whiskey rebellion like trail ride every year. This is an image from 2017 in this part of Pennsylvania where you essentially recreate the march of the farmers, the rebels, as they are moving to protest this law. So anyway, if you want to be a part of it, they're probably not having it this year. Well, I don't know. It's in May. Maybe 2021. Maybe things will be better by then. We'll see. There is criticism of Washington's policies. And again, I think that this is something that we don't think about when it comes to George Washington. We sort of just see him as a god among men, this figure of American mythology. But and although he is, like, I don't want to undermine his place in American history at all, but I do just want to reiterate that he is still human, that he is still making decisions, and that some people are against him, or at least against the decisions that he makes. Let's see. The French Revolution is going on. There are a few things that Washington does that really upset Thomas Jefferson, to the point where he actually resigns his position as Secretary of State in 1794 because he's pro-French. He's pro-French Revolution, right? He thinks that the United States should be standing up for the rebellion in France and going in to help. And George Washington disagrees. He wants to stay neutral. He doesn't think the U.S. should be getting involved in overseas conflicts, no matter how righteous the cause might be. And he doesn't want to upset anyone who could be a potential ally, i.e. the French government or even the British government, because the British government is not too excited about it either. So there's also an event that happens called the Citizen Gannett interview, and I'm sure there's a prettier way to say that with a fancier French accent. But essentially, he is a French envoy to the United States during the French Revolution. And there's a lot of feeling that he is trying to stoke revolutionary sentiment in the United States, like to turn public opinion toward the revolution. And so he will be a figure of much controversy. He'll be sent back to France. He'll be allowed asylum. There's a lot of back and forth. But essentially, this is sort of emblematic of what's going on in the tension between Jefferson and Washington. The Proclamation of Neutrality of 1793, where the United States says, we're going to stay out of it, reiterated by John Adams. It's also during this time period where we have those two treaties that I mentioned on a previous slide, Jay's Treaty and also Pinckney's Treaty. We also have continued clashes with Native American groups in 1794 and in 1795. And so there is a whole lot of drama, controversy during George Washington's administration. And I like this quote up here in the top right where it says, "Sane foreign policy for dummies." It's a quote by George Washington. "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is to have with them as little political connection as possible. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." You can judge for yourself the legacy of that and how well that worked out. So what sort of precedents does he set? Well, he sets a precedent that the president will serve 2 terms only, that he will be called Mr. President, that he gets to appoint a cabinet, that neutrality is the best policy, that Great Britain is our sort of first love in the United States, that even though we rejected them as a parent, we still want to be their friend. So we still want to maintain special relationship with Great Britain and engage in a lot of trade with them. And also his farewell address, in which he warns of political parties, of becoming like this idea of sectionalism, where you have the North versus the South, the merchants versus the farmers, that kind of thing. He warns about foreign alliances, or he calls them foreign entanglements, and he says that it will be very important to respect the Constitution. Of political parties up there in the top right, he says, political parties are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. And again, reflect on whether or not you think that that is something that has come to fruition. From 1789 to 1824, you do see the beginnings of a political party system. We had mentioned the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and now we're going to be talking more about Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. Democratic Republicans are anti-Federalists. Later on, they're going to drop the Republican part and become Democrats, but they're not the Democrats of today. They're the Democrats of the 1800s. So the Federalists want a stronger federal government, sort of big government fans. The anti-Federalists, who become the Democratic Republicans, who eventually become the Democrats, because that's a mouthful, right? They want a stronger focus on state rights. So Alexander Hamilton is the one we associate most with the Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is the one we associate most with the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists are going to advocate for strong national policies, a strong central government. They are loose constructionists, which means that they are more likely to interpret the Constitution. Remember back to that necessary and proper clause. They'll say, oh, I think it's in the implied powers. It's implied that we can do that. I think we can do that under the necessary and proper clause, right? They favor commerce and manufacturing. They tend to be based in more urban areas, and they tend to be more pro-British and more anti-French Revolution. And again, their power is going to be concentrated in the Northeast. For Democratic Republicans, with Thomas Jefferson, they're going to favor states' rights. They're going to advocate for strong local and state governments. They are going to be strict constitutionalists. If it's not in there, you cannot do it. I don't care what it says about implied powers. I don't care what you think necessary and proper means. It has to be explicitly stated. They tend to be more rural, more agricultural, anti-British, more pro-French Revolution, and they tend to be concentrated in the West and the South. The election of 1796 is an important one. You have these two guys here, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, and you can see how the voting lines broke down. You have the Federalist, John Adams, against the Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson, and Adams is going to win. This is really interesting. Look down at the bottom. It says in elections before 1804, each elector could vote for two candidates. The candidate with the largest number of votes was declared president. The candidate with the second highest number of votes was declared vice president. And I want you to think what a Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton presidency, vice presidency would look like. And if you think government could function that way, because it's an interesting thought. Could you have people of opposing viewpoints work together in the same administration? So here we have a Federalist and a Democratic Republican sort of fighting it out in the election of 1796. Before I close out our conversation, let me just go back to this slide. I think I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the Founding Fathers as flawed humans. I think that it's incredibly important to acknowledge the significant failings that each of these individuals had. And there's such a discussion these days about monuments and tearing down monuments or preserving monuments. And sometimes, George Washington has even been brought up. And should we be preserving his memory because he was a slave owner, and he was a slave owner. And Thomas Jefferson, my goodness, Thomas Jefferson had children, many children, with a female slave that he owned. That's often her name is Sally Hemings. She's often referred to as his mistress, which I don't like because it implies a much more consensual style relationship. And there's no way that you can have that when you are a slave owner and slave. So they are absolutely flawed individuals. I think that it's a conversation worth having, but I also think that you can study and learn about the achievements of these giants of American history and hold that other thought at the same time. So I want us to to do both things. I want us to learn and admire even the accomplishments of these early leaders of the United States, while at the same time fully acknowledging their horrible behavior in other areas of their lives. And there are a million different defenses and accusations that you could levy at each of these people. I mean, my goodness, look what ends up happening to Thomas or to Alexander Hamilton. Dies in a duel because he can't, stop having mistresses, essentially. But each of these individuals is human. It's important to acknowledge that. I don't want to gloss over it, but I also don't want that to be a reason for us not to learn and be impressed with our American history, because it is part of our history. All right, guys, we'll be back to talk more about Adams in the next go around. Let me know if you've got questions.